seemed to be that they were trying to make a distinction between medical assistance versus technology assistance, and why one was so wrong, but like they wanted, right, warp.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but giving them warp, well, that is completely wrong. That breaks, every.
Well, I
Prime
kind of agree with that, though, and not because of the Prime Directive.
But the medicine is a type of technology.
Yes, but I don't. But that's why I don't agree with it for the Prime Directive reasons. The problem is you can't give them the technology because they haven't learned their way up to it.
Mm-hmm.
So they're more likely to do damage to themselves trying to harness this.
You can use that exact same argument with the medicine.
No, they're not going to kill more of them with the medicine than without.
They wanted to test a vaccine and they start testing on human life. That's going to be just as detrimental if they're getting it wrong. So they need to build up to it. They just can't be given. That same argument works for the medication as it does for warp drive.
I don't agree because I think they're closer to the technology used in the medication than they are with a warp drive.
Yeah, but there's still a gap.
Yeah, but that gap is so much smaller that they can still create this drug fairly harmlessly.
Well, then maybe in the 10 years, if we came back to Enterprise, and we shall see.
Well, don't get me started with the fact we were only 4 years long. But no, I think the gap is wider on the technological side of warp drive than it is on the use of vaccine. Because, again, they have zero knowledge of antimatter, which can destroy the universe. I mean, it's wide-ranging effects, opposed to if they decide to go cheap and make this vaccine in a bad way, they might wipe themselves out, but they're not wiping out other planets.
Yeah, I think the scale is just smaller, but I think the idea is the same.
It might be the same, but the gap is still smaller, too, because
Right.
they have vaccines. They don't have any kind of antimatter use. So I get your point. I just don't think they're... I think one is close enough that you can hand it to them and not worry too much. The other one is, oh, man, I don't know what to do. And they make that point because... And I don't like the point they make in that episode. I think it's an awful one. Because T'Pol goes, well, the Vulcans tried that and we're still 90 years ago and we're still there. Yeah, but we don't want you there. You're still there because you are there to help us, but you're not really helping us. And it's even said later in the episode that the Vulcans held back the Earth, the humans.
Yeah.
So your argument for not wanting to stay and help is ridiculous, although it could just be simply said, we can't stay the 5 or 6 years it's going to take to bring them up to speed.
Right.
And that's, I mean... it's not going to take 5 or 6 years. Here's the vaccine. Here's how to use it. Make it like this. Inject it like that. Have a good day. Opposed to, okay, now we have to go get dilithium. Okay, now we have to do this. You have to have a containment field. Containment field has to be like this. There's a lot more steps involved. So I think if they could have stayed, it's not a bad thing to give them. But they don't have that time to stay and teach them.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting also when... I think it was Phlox that was, sort of debating Archer. And because they're like, well, we can't interfere. And we would interfere with their evolution process if we gave them this vaccine. And Phlox says, practicing medicine is interfering with evolution. And I thought that was so good.
It's the other way around.
Archer said that?
Phlox is saying we can't interfere. And Archer says practicing medicine is by nature interfering.
Oh, okay. That's what I
remember,
meant.
Phlox doesn't want to give it to him. And Archer does, and Phlox says it's against my nature as a scientist, and Archer's making the argument it's against your nature as a doctor to not help. It's your job to help. And Phlox is saying, well, because it's an evolutionary trait, I shouldn't do it because then the Mank can rise to the dominant species.
Right, yes. So I like that idea that practicing medicine does interfere with our evolution. I mean, we use the average death rate, was age 30, 40, and now we're up to the 70s and 80s,
Yep.
And that is because of modern medicine.
Absolutely. Among other things, but yes, but we use technology to interfere all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Food is harvested, even if you take organic food, okay? Because I'm not going to get into this argument with people. But the way they harvest food now is better so you can make it cheaper. Simply, technology was used to make it easier to get food. We don't have to hunt. I can live on a little house on Long Island and get meat. I don't need a farm for that anymore. Milk comes right to my house. It's been doing that for 100 years. I get it, but point is, it's a lot easier now than it was 200 years ago, and that all of that adds up to living into your 70s and 80s, like you said.
Yeah, and that evolution of farming. I mean, we used to only eat things that were in season. And now I can get apples year round. I can get strawberries year round. Like strawberries is a spring vegetable and I can get them year round, which sometimes when I go shopping, I'm like, this is so crazy because I remember, my grandfather was a farmer and, we would eat seasonal fruits and vegetables because that's what was being harvested. And I just go to the grocery store and look at it sometimes. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have this year round. It's amazing the advancement in farming and technology that is there.
Well, go to the supermarket right now and there's mangoes, papayas, and dragon fruit sitting next to each other. You could not get them in New York 100 years ago, period. Yeah. In season or not, they would not make it here to New York. Mm-hmm. Now I get them all year round. Yeah. Avocados. All these things have changed.
Yep.
And I'm not even talking about GMOs here. I'm strictly using greenhouses.
Yeah.
Has made them so they can grow them year round.
Yep.
It's insane. But back to what we were saying. So Archer was arguing that you have to help, and Phlox was arguing that you can't help. But I think they're both arguing from a point of emotion. Now, is there a common ground somewhere where you can help yet stop the exploitation of the Mang? Yes. And I think that, again, Star Trek does this sometimes, and I understand why, but I don't necessarily like it. They hedge their bets, and they make the Mank almost an enslaved race. I mean, they're exploited, so it's not enslaved is a wrong word, but they're exploited and they're held down on purpose so that you don't feel that bad that they let another race die off because they're not that good anyway. But what if they were living together side by side with none of those complications? Mm-hmm. That changes the tone of when you find out one race is about to be annihilated, even if not by the fault of anyone else, just evolution is going to kill them. Do you still feel like you shouldn't help them?
Yeah, if they were more on equal.
Absolutely. If they both were equal, everything equal, they both ran the society, they both had access to, because remember, the Mank didn't have access to fertile ground, and they didn't have, they were basically given, they felt like they were being taken care of because the Vlakians grew all the food, did all that kind of stuff. I guess they probably farmed the land or whatever for them or something. I don't remember exactly what it said. But then they were given, because remember that it happens in that episode where he comes over and asks if they want food. And they end up eating it, and they go, well, where do you get it? And you find out that, well, they give it to us because we don't have any land to farm ourselves, and we don't have any clean water, and we have to get it all from them. And at first, Phlox doesn't care. He's like, well, they don't care. Why should you care? Well, just because someone's exploited and doesn't realize they're exploited doesn't mean that you should ignore it. That's a whole other issue for another podcast, but that's the point he gets to, because now he does care at the end because he found one that learned how to speak English. Mm-hmm. He gets him the help, and he starts to realize he coded all this by gene type and by family and by bloodline and by this and by that. So he starts to realize they're not just lower species. We were just led to believe they were a lesser species. But what if that wasn't true? What if they were just both running for office, they held spots in the government, they farmed the land together, whatever, they all had equal footing? Would you feel as okay with the fact of letting them die off?
Right. And just because, and the fact that Phlox is down there and they're gathering the blood samples, like that's when Phlox sees that intelligence. And it's like, why wouldn't you assume that they are intelligent before that? Definitely. And that's when he gets, like you're saying, that emotional connection to the mink.
Yeah, well, the Valakians kind of led him down the path of they're not as smart as we are, and we kind of take care of them like little brothers. So I get how we ended up there, but it's just ridiculous to me because it's not until he realizes that they're smart that he even cares of being held down. But again, the being held down is only put in the episode so that we, the viewer, don't feel as bad that the Valakians are going to be wiped out in less than 200 years. And I hate that Star Trek does that sometimes because it makes the moral decision a lot easier to bear when what's the negative is happening to a quote-unquote bad people. And while they seem nice, they're exploiting another race. So even then, Phlox makes the argument, well, if any planet, one would have extincted the other already. They've learned how to live harmoniously. And then he realizes that wasn't completely true, so he wants to get rid of them. But in a perfect world, you could stay and force them to treat them better. All right, we're going to give you this antidote. We're going to give you the vaccine to stop this genetic mutation that's happening in you. But we're going to watch over you, and we're going to make sure that you no longer, you share the land with them, and you don't just give them food. You give them an equal standing in the society. That brings up a whole other set of problems.
Yeah, which is totally interfering with society.
We've already done that, though.
Yeah.
So the idea that we can't interfere more is kind of stupid. We've already done this. Mm-hmm. We have them begging for warp drive, and we're telling them no because it's too dangerous, which I get. But we're also giving them, and then at the end, we're giving them a way to survive for 10 more years. That's almost cruel.
Yeah, it is.
Like, here you go. Here's 10 more years. Here's hope. But at the end of those 10 years, you're going to be right back where you are right now.
Unless they figure something out.
And who do they come across? The Ferengi. I mean, they wouldn't help. They'd only help them if they could pay them, and they can't pay them. So, but T'Pol says she never heard of them. I don't know if that was true or a lie, though. I don't remember if the Vulcans had come across the Ferengi before then.
That's what I have in my notes. I'm like, did she lie? ?
Yeah, I don't remember the answer, and I didn't have enough time to look it up, but the way she answered, it definitely seems like she lied.
Yeah.
She had kind of a, no.
Vulcans don't know the Ferengi. I'm like, what?
Yeah, it seems a little odd the way she answered that question. But, I mean, I guess it makes sense that she would say that because they don't know the Ferengi in TOS, so.
Yeah, they were just trying to follow suit.
Yeah, the way she answered seemed like a lie.
I know. I have that in my notes.
It seemed awful. Yeah. So I mean, I don't know. At the beginning, that was the part of it too, because they looked to her because the Vulcans already had a set of standards. They didn't call it the Prime Directive or anything, but they had like a ruling on this. And she said that the chance of contamination was small because they had already run across 2 species with warp drive. The Ferengi, and I forget who the other one was. So they already knew what warp drive was, so you're not contaminating that. You're not teaching them what warp drive is. So I don't get why that stops at I don't know. You went there with the intent of helping them find a cure. You found a cure, and then you didn't give it to them.
Yeah, that was what was crazy. And it was weird that Phlox came up with the vaccine and didn't announce it as soon as he found it.
Yeah, well... Yes, and the whole part of that was he was trying, it was first and foremost, this is an episode to tell you who Phlox is. I mean, that's what the intent of this episode was, to give you a background on Phlox himself, which is why it starts out as an episode where he's writing a letter to a colleague, Dr. Lucas, and this is like his biggest struggle. So that's why he didn't tell, because he didn't know as a scientist if it was proper or not. But again, we don't have this kind of ethical conundrum because we don't have a directive yet. It's said in the episode, Archer looks to Phlox and says, one day my people are going to come up with a directive and to govern how we handle this. I forget the exact words, but at the end he says, but until then, every day I have to remind myself I'm not out here to play God. Mm-hmm. But you're still playing God because you decided not to help. You signed them to death when you had an answer. It's not like you decided not to help and left. And you had no answer. Because I think that's still different. I don't know if it's necessarily any better, but it's different because you didn't come up with the answer and then withhold it from them. If God is your argument here, right, which I don't necessarily know if that's where they're going with the episode, but let's just, okay, people do think that God has reasons for everything, right? Well, his reason for you to find the answer and leave with it would be what? It's fate we're talking about in any form, whether it's religious or not. You finding the answer is the answer that you're supposed to help.
Yeah. Well, and that's why it's interesting. Had Phlox not even admitted to finding a cure, then they would have had to have left without helping.
Yes.
And so that was the big dilemma for Phlox. And it's like, oh, it's tough.
in the long run anyway, he cares more about his duty to